It's the high summer of 1940. The RAF and Hitler's Luftwaffe are fighting for control of the skies over Britain.
The British people are facing a battle for their country's very survival.
Can Prime Minister Winston Churchill lead a truly national effort to defeat Hitler?
Stay with us and find out here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me is my good friend, Dr. Warren Dockter. And in this episode, we're going to start off by considering the impact which Churchill had on the running of the British government.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Richard. And I know that this is sort of your thunder, so I'm not going to steal it too much. But we think of Churchill's speeches today as his extraordinary leadership. How do you think Churchill felt about that?
Well, I think he was kind of a little bit grumpy about it. Of course, he was pleased to be thought of as a good speaker, but he wanted probably more than that to be remembered as a great military leader. And so there's this kind of famous speech which he actually gives on his 80th birthday, where he says it was the British people who were the sort of had the lion heart. I was the person who just expressed the roar of the lion. But he also then says, I like to think that I was also the person who told the lion where it should put its claws. So giving the military direction and not just kind of inspirational words.
Right. So that's one of the things I think if you look back through Churchill's life, he was kind of in love with this idea of himself as a sort of brilliant tactician and a kind of a brilliant military strategic mind, even though history doesn't necessarily bear that out.
Well, quite. But thinking about his, he brought strengths and weaknesses, I suppose. You might well say that the strengths outweighed the weaknesses to his method of running the government. And I think the strengths were that he was kind of an impatient guy, right? Now, in a lot of his life, this could be sort of not a particularly good quality, but at the point where the war effort did need to be significantly accelerated, then this sort of insistence on immediate action, and of course there were these famous stickers which he put on documents saying "action this day," this thing which I'm asking about has to be responded to now. I mean, I think that was genuinely helpful.
And one of the things that I really find compelling about Churchill's war leadership is how he kind of centralized things to himself. He essentially created absolute authority for himself. He occupied the office of Prime Minister and also at the War Office. Another thing that I find is an enormous strength for Churchill in the way that he ran the war, even this early on, it was his relationship with intelligence. He even read raw data, raw intercepts and information to give people a direction on where to go. And I think that's kind of remarkable interest when you compare to other war leaders like FDR later on, who kind of didn't care about intelligence at all.
Yeah, he was very curious. He was kind of hungry for information. I think it's also worth saying that he was a sort of strong believer in doing business on paper, that he didn't want just to give out verbal instructions. He wanted to have all decisions recorded in writing, and he said he wasn't going to accept responsibility for any supposed decisions unless they were put down on paper. And so he was kind of a night owl. This was one of the things which was frustrating for a lot of people, that he didn't keep the same hours as normal people. He worked until very late at night or early in the morning, and kept up his advisors, who themselves had to get up then 7 o'clock the next morning or earlier. And so they kind of got a bit knackered. But he would then sit in bed and then start sort of dictating minutes and instructions while he's still in his pajamas.
Yeah, I there's a lot of interesting kind of facts about his daily routine during the war, and I've always found his hours of operation to be an interesting thing about the man, because he didn't really care about other people's hours. And didn't he say he sort of picked up those hours while he was in Cuba as a young man? The kind of idea of taking a siesta in the afternoon and then working late at night. It's easier for him to do than some of his undersecretaries, perhaps.
Well, I guess it's worth thinking about some of the concrete things that the government did. There were also important kind of legislative changes. There were new emergency powers which gave the government wide authority over kind of people and property, and a new Minister of Labour. This is important. Ernest Bevin, who was a former trade union leader, put in charge of trying to make sure that the right people were in the right jobs in industry. But then, of course, there were some quite drastic measures taken with respect to, for example, so-called enemy aliens.
Right. Richard, do you think the British public kicked back on any of this? Because one of these things that he also put under the British control was banks. And I can imagine if that happened in the United States, that would be a problem.
Well, I don't think that people would have noticed that much difference in terms of going to their local branch and trying to operate their accounts. They certainly would have found, of course, that because of shortage of hard currency, it became much harder for Britain to buy sort of goods from the United States, for example. So things like tobacco sort of started to be sourced from other people. So people would have noticed differences in the shops for sure. Was there kickback? There was a bit of kickback because one thing that the government wants to do is to try and find out what the population think at a time when the government is also kind of imposing censorship on the press to sort of prevent people saying entirely what they think. And so the Ministry of Information, founded at the start of the Second World War, actually tried to carry out surveys to find out about morale and what people's attitude is to the war. And this does actually cause some sort of suspicion from the people. It does cause a reaction because there's a dislike of what is seen as being sort of overbearing, and there are all these attempts to stop gossip. The government is on the one hand wants to find out what people think, but on the other hand, it's saying you mustn't spread defeatist or damaging rumors, which people, in the absence of information, they start saying all sorts of kind of weird stuff, which would be pretty familiar from today's world of social media in certain respects. There is a somewhat febrile atmosphere, and the government does make some missteps in terms of how it's handling its propaganda. I guess a good example of that is that Lord Beaverbrook, good friend of Churchill, going back decades, he's now Minister of Aircraft Production. And as a really a sort of stunt, he says, well, everybody needs to kind of donate their pots and pans so that they could be melted down in order to make Spitfires, which, to be honest, is not particularly helpful for making Spitfires, actually. Also, people can see that there are still aluminium pots and pans in the shops.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Beaverbrook, and that goes back to the on-the-ground changes that Churchill was making. So placing a trusted friend, Beaverbrook, at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, it led to him injecting this Churchillian urgency into the production of planes.
But I suppose I would say that it's still controversial to the extent to which he genuinely succeeded in speeding up production in a meaningful way, or whether he kind of merely kind of diverted resources in an inefficient way from other things. But I guess what we've got to remember is that Churchill's got so many things crossing his desk at the same time. He's got to worry about a shortage of trained pilots. He's got to worry about sort of finding out that there's a German technology which is being used for sort of precision bombing, a kind of radio beam or kind of pair of radio beams, which is used to guide German bombers. And a guy called R.V. Jones, a scientist called R.V. Jones, sort of brings this information to Churchill, and he then acts to sort of prioritize trying to jam these beams, which is basically then done quite successfully. So this is what's been sort of labelled the Wizard War. So the sort of the boffins or the scientists trying to outdo each other on either side.
Yeah, well, what did he call them? His corkscrew minds that worked for him, working in cryptography or decryptography. And we can see a kind of significant legacy of Churchill's interest in intelligence and also in science, and indeed science fiction, that I think you can see plays out in some of the things he prioritized, particularly early on, once Britain was really being attacked, and exploring all measures, including the use of radar and these kind of radio beams. Because I think Churchill had, if you've ever read Paul Kennedy's book, The Engineers of Victory, I think there's a real interesting point there about this sort of culture of, hey, if you get something wrong, it's okay, we'll try it again. Despite the fact that there was sort of competitive things going on. As you mentioned, Beaverbrook was sort of at odds with his MAP, which was the Ministry of Airplane Production, with the actual Air Ministry. So you have this infighting, but it's nowhere near as sort of like a Darwinistic hellscape that was the kind of Nazi, the way that the Germans ran their war effort, right? So I think that I think Paul Kennedy calls it a culture of encouragement. He's encouraging his scientists, his intelligence operatives, everyone he can. Oh, hey, we'll figure this out. We'll figure this out. Behind those closed doors, and I think that made a tremendous difference in the way the war was waged.
And I think there's another point which kind of brings us on to the key speech that we want to talk about, which is that we were talking earlier about sort of Churchill's own speeches, and in the immediate aftermath, for example, of his 18th of June, your finest hour speech, there's some reaction about that in the press, which is saying, well, these is kind of fine words, is all very well, but what people actually want to know is what they should be doing. Like ordinary people kind of need clear instructions. And essentially there's a sort of a developing sense as people are under threat. Remember that the sort of threat of invasion and the threat of aerial bombing is kind of hanging over people. That sort of the idea of ordinary civilians and not just people who were in the military being direct participants in the war and kind of morally equivalent to the people who were actually doing the fighting. So whether they're, sort of firemen or whether they're on the production line. And this is when the sort of the label of the People's War, which did exist before, starts to be applied more and starts to kind of take on a slightly more radical edge. And I think that is the context for this key but actually rather forgotten speech which Churchill gave on 14th of July, 1940.
Well, Richard, I'm excited to explore this speech, and I hope that our audience is too. So stick around and we'll get into it. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and my British counterpart is Professor Richard Toye. And we were just exploring Churchill's leadership during the summer of 1940. And in the last episode, we discussed a speech which was obscure. But I'm not really at all familiar with the speech we're going to talk about now.
And that is ironic because at the time it was arguably the most popular, certainly one of the most popular of his speeches, judged by ordinary people's reactions, and much more so even than the really famous ones like Finest Hour or Fight Them on the Beaches.
So, I mean, it's really interesting that going into these speeches, we have discussed the Finest Hour speech and the fact that Churchill has this sort of rhetorical power that potentially even swayed the choices there in the dark days of May, and then suddenly there's no one's ever heard of.
Yeah, exactly. So this is July the 14th, obviously a significant choice of date is Bastille Day, the French National Day. So the broadcast is to a considerable extent aimed at the population of France, but it is also going out to, of course, the British people, as you say, around the world. There were, his speeches were reported globally. Even the Germans couldn't avoid reporting them to some extent, even if they were going to distort them, wrench them out of context, because actually people could and did listen to broadcasts within Germany illegally. And there were also BBC services in German, which were specifically targeted at the German population. So the Nazis couldn't pretend that these speeches weren't happening.
Right. And so he's able to then communicate out with this speech, which became known as the War of the Unknown Warriors.
Right. And it's really important if I can kind of chuck in some context there.
Yeah, please do.
Which is that I should say there is historical debate about this issue of the so-called People's War. Now, People's War is the name of a very famous book published in the late 1960s by a guy called Angus Calder. Latterly, Professor David Edgerton at
Yeah.
King's London has argued that sort of the idea of a People's War was a myth, but he's not only arguing that the war itself was sort of not a people's war, but rather he's even claiming that it was historians like Calder in the late 1960s who almost came up with the idea themselves. He's saying people didn't talk about this at the time. Well, they did talk about it at the time, with greatest respect to David, um, and and actually, this idea of the People's War was something which went back at least as far as the Crimean War and beyond. And at that time, it just meant a war which people support. It's kind of a morally good war because the British people are in favour of it. But it had taken on a new meaning in the context of World War II, which was to say that it was a war in which ordinary people were contributing directly because they were directly involved in it. If they were under the threat of air attack, they were engaged in it was a kind of a total war which required production effort from them and so on. And so people like firemen, ambulance workers, there hadn't been at this stage very many bombings, but sort of those kinds of people were were kind of morally equivalent, if you like, to people who were actually in the armed services directly engaged in fighting. And so this was kind of an idea which could kind of work across the spectrum, but it did have a sort of a radical or a left-wing tinge, this idea of sort of popular involvement. And David Edgerton points out that sometimes people were saying, well, in order to be successful, to fight this war successfully, this needs to become a people's war. They weren't necessarily saying it is one already. But things like the creation of the Home Guard, the sort of local defence volunteers, as they were initially called, which involved ordinary people in the defence of the country, these were the kinds of things which contributed to this idea of people's war. And equally, the broadcaster J.B. Priestley, although he didn't use the term People's War in this particular broadcast, at least one other occasion, and it was his broadcast in the aftermath of Dunkirk, where he kind of pays tribute to sort of the small boats who had rescued the men from the beaches, and sort of talking about the paddle steamers that had been involved in sort of holiday-style paddle steamers that had rescued soldiers, and so that had been very popular. So this was a kind of a line of argument that certainly went down well with the public. So that when Churchill is talking about the war of the unknown warriors, he's kind of talking about these anonymous men and women, that sort of the everyday folk who are making this big contribution. To a certain extent, you could say that in doing that, he is leaping upon a bandwagon which has already got a strong popular response. And so he's kind of maybe makes it his own to a certain extent, but he's not the first person to initiate this idea. And although, again, he doesn't use the term People's War, when other people are talking about this, we should say this was a speech which was a straightforward radio broadcast, one which was not given in the House of Commons, so loads of people did hear it at the time. Journalists did refer to Churchill's speech about the People's War, so they had this idea of the People's War in their minds. He used the term the War of the Unknown Warriors. Journalists kind of put the two things together, and then it becomes Mr. Churchill's account of the People's War.
Of the People's War, yeah. Which is really interesting, and just because I'm a history nerd, I mean, I've seen the Crimean War referred to, as you said, as a people's war, which is a vastly different meaning, just that there were sort of ordinary people signing up to go fight over in the Crimea. And that it was a sort of a social
Or
thing,
even
not
just
nothing like
we think that this war is a good idea.
right. Yeah, exactly. That it's about honor and greatness, and this is our duty because of the kind of the concert of Europe. Those kinds of like, I don't know, higher ideals, and people thought it was good, so it's a people's war. Whereas this is much different because it is Churchill acknowledging the sort of contributions made by the masses. And as you say, he sort of co-opts that idea, and then the press kind of create. I mean, that's interesting that the press kind of create the myth of the People's War, or not the myth, but the concept of the People's War through Churchill's language and kind of interpreting it. But of course,
Yeah.
that's what's happening in Britain, and this, in many ways, is a message to France.
Absolutely. And he insists in the speech that Britain's aim was to restore the greatness and territory of France, which, might have had a few French people saying, "Why have you just tried to destroy our fleet?" In that case, of course, he would see that in a different perspective. And he's kind of trying to reach out, which I'm sure he does successfully, to a proportion of the French population, I should say. Is obviously there was not unanimous support for Pétain and the Vichy regime, but at this stage, I would say that was kind of quite a hard sell.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you're right. I also think that he presents things as a longer durée, I should say, than
Yeah,
this immediate thing. I mean, he frames, rightly so, Hitler as this sort of arch villain who will continue to attack by air as long as he has the strength to do so. So he's envisioning not something that's going to be over in a month or two. And in fact, he tells them not to think in terms of for the summer. He says not only for the summer, but for the winter, not only for 1941, but also for 1942. I
and
added the word also. That was a quote. Go ahead.
that's a really interesting insight, though, into how long he maybe was thinking the war would last at this time, right? Now,
Yeah.
maybe he thought it was gonna last even longer than 1942, and maybe he didn't wanna go. He knew that thinking that saying it was gonna be going on in 1942 still was depressing enough without having to say, 1943 and 1944 and 1945 as well. But I guess that kind of gives a sense of what he thought was a reasonable time frame to be thinking about. And, um, I mean, I think this is actually really important in terms of what he consistently did well throughout the war in his speeches, which was to not give in to the temptation to excessive optimism and say, "Oh, it's all gonna be over soon."
Yeah. Well, and again, I think there's something interesting in the fact that he does frame the Nazi regime as this sort of existential threat, existential problem, and that this isn't something that we can just come to terms with or deal with in the course of a few months. This is going to take time. And I do think strategically that's really interesting. As you say, he's thinking about, hey, well, maybe this is resolved by 1940 in a way that's palatable. And as we know, he couldn't say, hey, till 45, guys, buckle up.
Yeah.
And he may not even have been thinking in those terms. But what we can say is that by presenting this in this way, I mean, number one, he does help birth this idea of a people's war. And what's really interesting is that the way the public, the British public and audiences receive the speech also sort of helps bind everyone together in this sort of Churchillian, pugnacious, resolute way. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it definitely is a very popular speech. It was listened to. We have figures from the BBC Listener Research Department about how many people listen to all of these speeches. We've just got the raw figures. We don't know how scientific these figures really were, but nevertheless,
Right.
they were measuring it
Right.
in the same way throughout. So we can probably say if it said that one speech got 50% and the next speech got 60%, then that was probably true that there was genuinely an increase, right? So this
And
speech,
for those of you who are historians at home, that's called methodology.
and our methodology tells us that the speech, well, according to the BBC Listener Research Department, got 64.4% of the potential audience, which is obviously very high, bearing in mind two
Yeah.
things. There was basically only one broadcaster, so you didn't have a lot of choice. But also, that said, you would be struggling to get significantly more than that. I think the King on one occasion gets 70%, actually. Um, but bearing in mind that various people are going to be at work, going to be out of reach of radios, might just want to go to bed early, might be sick, all of those things. These are very high figures, and certainly it was very popular. Which again, I mean, given that this one was actually a broadcast, and I think a recording exists, why do we not know more about it?
Right. That is interesting because that's also, when, as you say, with numbers around 64.4% that he's pulling down this, you think that this would sort of live in the imagination in a much broader way than as we imagine it now, because this is sort of the moment where Churchill and kind of comes to almost represent Great Britain in a way that he epitomizes the feeling of the country, and that his strategy for how we're going to do this is correct. And it's just interesting that we don't know more about this speech. I mean, and again, I study this, and I really didn't know that much till we started doing this episode.
Well, I'm gonna offer a couple of theories. One of which is that again there aren't any particularly famous phrases in it, which I think is interesting because it shows that actually Churchill could write a really popular speech without actually having to include any of those famous phrases. I'm going to suggest again that actually maybe the message of this People's War, although he did it well, isn't actually the message which we most associate with Churchill himself, that he was actually straying slightly onto kind of other people's rhetorical territory, and therefore it wasn't core Churchill, and therefore didn't get remembered. I think we've got to say that the circulation of recordings through documentaries, the sound bites that get played on news programs when you kind of do a look back to the 90s item, these things all really help. And so I think what I'm gonna suggest is that both speeches show that when we think of Churchill's rhetoric, we automatically think of half a dozen famous quotations: "You give us the tools and we'll finish the job," "Fighting on the beaches," "Finest hour," "The few," etc., etc. But actually, a world-class speech is maybe more about crafting a message than it is necessarily just about hitting a good soundbite.
Yeah, well, and I agree. And I think, to sum this up, I guess from my point of view, is that you see in both of these speeches not just his rhetoric, but he's proving to the world with the first speech that he's willing to take action, even action that could be considered questionable, to go to true lengths to defend his country and the aim of the Allies, and the French inside France, who stand with the Bordeaux government that would become the Vichy government, that he's willing to go as far as it takes to do his position. And he's also, in the second speech, showing that it's not just him, it's all of Britain that's resolute in doing this. And I think that these two speeches compounded really have a real legacy and a knock-on effect. And again, as you say and explained, it's interesting that it's not one that we think of. To those two are not two that we particularly think of today, but that they probably had a lasting and longer impact. But now they're almost lost to history, which is just really remarkable. Right. And I guess I'm just saying Churchill instinctively, or basically, understands that he has to keep morale good, and not just at home, right? Like, he's got to bolster the whole, what would become the Allies, right? Like, he still has people in France that he has to speak to. He's got to make sure that the Americans are paying attention, and that when they do come in, if they come in, they come in to support fully.
Actually, in July 1940, more so than in May and June. And maybe this, July
Yeah.
1940 was actually the sort of the height of morale. Certainly, Churchill's popularity figures are extraordinary. Sort of something like 93% approval. Throughout the whole war, it never falls below, I think, 78%, which is enviable. We have to read that with a note of caution, given that when actually it was a general election at the end of the war, he lost it. But nevertheless, there was, I don't think that all sorts of criticism disappeared at any point. There was always a bit, but it was certainly probably at its lowest level at this exact moment. Winston Churchill has called the British nation to arms
And held out the prospect of freedom to Nazi-occupied Europe.
His greatest challenge is to transform hope into reality.
We'll continue the story of this remarkable man and how he met another remarkable man, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, next time here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.
Wait, Richard, what is for my American friends, what does KBO mean anyway?
Okay, well, this was a favorite saying of Churchill, and listeners need to kind of make sure they're listening to this after the watershed because it stands for keep buggering on. I don't know to what extent buggering is going to really translate into American English. I maybe leave that to you. But basically, you saying keep on going in spite of adversity.
That's great, Richard. Thank you.